Good morning, which it is for me here in Manhattan, and my special guest, Bruce Meyer, who's in Chicago. Bruce is a professor of economics in the Harris School of Policy at the University of Chicago. And I would say, perhaps without exaggeration, that he is the leading expert in the US, perhaps even in the world, on the measurement of poverty today. He's giving a keynote address at a conference later this week on labor statistics sponsored by the IZA. And I'm really fortunate to have him here to ask him a few questions about measuring poverty. So let me start off, Bruce, by welcoming you and asking you a question. Okay, in your keynote, you worry about regional differences in measuring poverty. Are these only because of regional cost of living differences, or is there something more to it beyond just cost of living?
So I think of there as being a lot of differences across geography that we probably don't account well for just using conventional price indices. That there are wage differences, certainly, and different characters of the safety nets. Some areas have much better safety nets and much better amenities, from schools to hospitals to parks, and those aren't well captured by price indices.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. I hadn't thought about the safety net issue. Let's assume that the safety net is less effective in more conservative or more right-wing states. Okay, so
Fair assumption.
that's a good assumption, I think. So if one were to worry about regional differences because of differences in the safety net, wouldn't that argue for a more inclusive poverty standard in right-wing states? And then shouldn't the governors there be very happy with that, because that would give them more federal money since more people would be measured as being in poverty?
You would think so, but the Republican, this gets into politics, but Republican governors have shown an unusual tendency to be unwilling to take federal money to help their poor citizens in the case of Medicaid expansions and unemployment insurance benefit expansions.
Right.
But you do see actions on the reverse, that people in high cost areas, New York, for example, AOC has argued for higher poverty thresholds for New York and for higher benefits for New York City. So that's the reverse.
Okay, that's good to see. I know in New York, one thing we do is that the cutoff point for jumbo mortgages, home mortgages, is much higher here, actually in Manhattan even, than any other place in the country. So we do make some acknowledgement on the federal grounds. Okay, let me ask you an even more difficult question, not on regional differences. And I discovered giving a lecture about 10 years ago in Germany that in Europe, they measure poverty relatively. It's 60% of the median household income. In the US, it's absolute. If you ran the world, what would you do? European relative or American absolute?
I'm going to kind of slip out of this difficult question and say we want both, because they measure different things. The absolute measure tells you how we have done as an economy over time in raising absolute standards at the bottom. And that's an important question. The relative measure is really a measure of inequality. And that's something we should care about too, but it's distinct from the absolute level of living standards, which is captured by an absolute poverty standard.
So I think what you're really saying is inequality and poverty are important, both, which I agree with fully. And yet, if we're talking about poverty, let's use the language carefully and talk about the American measure as being a poverty measure. Is that fair?
Yes, and the European language, at times they don't call it a poverty rate, they call it, there's another term that's often used. I'm sorry, it's eluding me right now. But they, I think, specifically do not call it a poverty rate when they're thinking about a relative standard.
Interesting indeed. Okay, let me ask you a final question, which I know you've been concerned about. Poverty is defined in terms of income. I don't care about my income. I care about what I buy. Why can't we define poverty in terms of the purchase of some market basket of goods, not in terms of the income needed to buy that market basket?
A number of people have argued that we should do that. Going back decades, one of your former colleagues, Dan Sleznick, was very emphatic about urging that we use consumption to measure poverty. The idea is that people's incomes may go up and down, but if they have some savings, if they have a house or a car, their living standards don't go up as much as their income may go up, and it doesn't fall as much as their income may fall. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is now embracing the idea of producing a consumption poverty measure, and they've gone on record that they would like to do it, and they are starting the process of creating a consumption poverty measure. So we may have one in the near future as an official measure, well, as an alternative measure produced by one of these statistical agencies. We have had consumption poverty measures produced by me and Jim Sullivan and other people, David Johnson, over the years, but nothing from the federal statistical system.
It's interesting is my colleague Dan Sleznick wrote his paper, I think, in the late 80s. And what you're saying is someday soon, we might actually have something like that in the real world. My concern is, and I'm absolutely certain, if that measure comes out, which it may well someday, I would be surprised if it doesn't imply different poverty rates across different areas from what we now have.
Mm-hmm.
And that being the case, I envision, maybe I'm wrong, a tremendous political brouhaha as different areas get different amounts of the federal money. Is that a reasonable concern, or and might that kill the whole idea?
Well, we don't have good enough consumption data or a big enough consumer expenditure survey to analyze consumption poverty at the state level. We could do it at the region level, but I think a bigger difference, one that would come out even when you look at poverty at the national level, is that the poverty rate for older Americans would be lower.
Yes.
And higher for children. That's one thing that you see when you look at consumption data. And that's not surprising because it turns out that, and this is a problem with official income data, is that people don't report their pensions in household surveys. There's great work by B. and Mitchell and others showing that about half of people don't report, who are receiving a pension, don't report it in the current population survey. And so that in itself overstates the poverty rate of the elderly by more than 2 percentage points.
Which is on a base of what, 12 or 14 percentage points probably.
Yes, so it's a big deal.
Yeah, especially in time of inflation like now, the elderly get Social Security. I expect to get a 7% raise on January 1. And my guess is, as a wage earner, you are probably not getting that big an increase this year, although I hope you are.
No.
No.
I can tell you I'm not.
Okay, I figured you knew already. Anyway, look, I did have one more question, but we've gone on longer than we had to, and you have other things to do. So Bruce, let me thank you very much for being with me today. This has been excellent, and we'll get it posted real soon.
Thank you, Dan, for the kind introduction and the great questions.
Thanks.